Hello again, everyone. So, we don't have a whole lot left to talk about when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Age, or industrialization, whatever you want to call it. The only things that we have left are the economic side of things and the reactions so far. We will talk about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution in our next unit. But for right now, we're going to finish up with economics and reactions. So, in this video, we're going to primarily focus on the economic side of things, the developments and the innovations. So, specifically, what we're going to look at is how did industrialization lead to the development of new economic systems during this time period. So, we also want to address, the changes that brought about these economic systems. We have already started to have this conversation when we started to talk about capitalism, socialism, and communism. Well, today we're going to explore those a little bit further. So we're going to look at these different ideologies and institutions and how they all contributed to change economically. We're going to look at abandoning mercantilism and adopting free trade policies. We're going to talk about Adam Smith's laissez-faire capitalism and free markets. And then we're going to talk about how capitalism led to increased standards of living for some, and how it continued to improve manufacturing methods. All right, so let's take a look at this image for a second. We are going to discuss this in class. But I want you to look at the public views of the individual political theories. So you have positives and negatives. So for a majority of people, socialism is a negative. And then you have capitalism is also being a negative, but mostly positive. So as you go down the list, you can see that there are some questions. I'm going to talk about those questions when I see you in class. So, before we get too far, let's do a quick lesson in economics. So, you have productive resources and means of production. So, you have this thing at the bottom, which are goods and services, and you need some things in order to produce those goods and services. So, first and foremost, you need land. And that land has water, and you have forests and wildlife. Well, you need labor to take those resources and make it into something that is producible. So that labor needs time, you need effort, you also need talent. And capital means that you need the money to give the laborers the means to take the natural resources to produce goods. So you need tools and machines and equipment. You need physical and human capital as well. And then you have these entrepreneurs who are the ones who come up with these ideas. They have a vision, they have a lot of energy, and they, establish organizations, and they use the three other resources in order to produce goods and services. So the entrepreneur at first works hard, and then eventually they don't have to work as hard they don't have to work as hard anymore because they have labor to produce the goods and services for the entrepreneurs. And this is where capitalism comes into play. Now, there are three different types of economic systems. You have traditional, command, and free market. So traditional is just, determined by tradition. It's passed on from generation to generation. How to produce it is, determined by what's customary. Who produces it? It's typically centered around a traditional family or social unit. So most of the traditional economies are seen in they're seen in traditional tribal groups or tribal areas. So the Inuits of Canada and the Aborigines of Australia. Then you have command economies. That's basically the government is telling the market what to produce. How to produce it is determined by the government, and for whom to produce is determined by the government. And the perfect example of that is North Korea. And then you have free market. What to produce is determined by the individuals. How to produce it is determined by the individual. And then for whom is determined by the individual. Then the best examples are the United States and, of course, England. So when you have a mixed economy, which emerged during the later years, you take this free market economy and the government intervention. So it's you take a free market and a command economy and you put them together. And that creates a mixed economy. So it still allows for entrepreneurs to make a profit, but you have to pay taxes to reduce inequality. You still have the freedom to set up businesses as long as they are within the bounds of government regulations. Prices are still determined by the market force, but there are taxes on goods. And then you have private ownership, still allowed in a mixed economy, but again, in the bounds of what the government is producing. So we talked about capitalism, socialism, and communism just a little bit. So we know that capitalism allows for private ownership. There is this invisible hand that is only there to regulate when needed. People are motivated by their own self-interest in order to gain wealth, and there is a less equal distribution of wealth. And this was thought up by Adam Smith. He wrote it all out in The Wealth of Nations. Now, on paper, according to Karl Marx, communism, the workers own all the businesses and they are the ones that regulate their own hours and means of production. But in reality, you have governments, this authoritarian government, dictatorships that own all the resources and means of production. And they set prices and they typically, set what is produced. And there's actually less incentive to work because it's a classless society. Everybody makes the same regardless if you work or not. So there's less benefit there, right? And then you have socialism, which is interested in a more equal distribution of wealth, more equal social classes. The government makes some decisions like regulations and taxes, but for the most part, it's still a fairly, free market, private ownership. There is a more equal distribution of wealth, as I already said. You also have national social programs for unemployment and welfare and social security. And then there are a lot of public goods and services that come out of socialism: parks, better infrastructure, better education systems, so on and so forth. So most countries fall somewhere in between capitalism and socialism. There's private ownership and ownership, that does exist. We in the United States are that same way too. So we aren't necessarily a purely free market. We are not true capitalists. We have some socialist programs, but for the most part, we tend to be more towards a free market economy. We lean more capitalist. Now, France and Sweden, which are some standards, Canada is also in there too, are more so in the middle, but they lean a little bit more capitalist. Now, when you start going to socialist and then communism, perfect examples of those would be China, Venezuela, and then North Korea. Venezuela, unfortunately, is not as good off as Canada or China is. And we honestly don't know what North Korea is. There hasn't been a purely planned economy or command economy since the Soviet Union. So maybe North Korea has learned some things from that. China definitely has as well. China, of course, is where we get all of our products made. So yeah. So mercantilism, if you don't remember what mercantilism is, the European colonization was based purely on the economic theory of mercantilism. The goal was to have economic gain that benefited the mother country. They encouraged exports, so nothing was accumulated here. It was all sent back, produced, and then we bought it back. And there was an there was an abundance of bullion, so an abundance of gold and silver that was sent back to the mother country. The raw materials were extracted from the colonies, and the finished goods and services are then sold or traded back to the colonies once they have been, manufactured. So the New World colonies actually helped expand the mother country's economy, tilting the balance of power in the world towards Europe. So France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and England. So it was very much unfavorable for colonies in the mercantilism era. So we know that capitalism is an economic system that's based on private ownership of capital goods and the means of production, right? So who came up with this idea? So it was Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish moral philosopher and a pioneer of political economic theory, one of the key figures in the Scottish Enlightenment, and he's best known for The Wealth of Nations, which is considered his magnum opus, so his greatest production. And it was his, first modern work of economics. Smith is cited as the father of modern economics and is still among the most influential thinkers in the field of economics today, even though he hasn't been alive for years. He is actually known for the invisible hand theory and the promotion of the laissez-faire free market economies. So what does laissez-faire mean? It means let them do. I remember it as lazy affair. So government has a lazy affair with the market. Adam Smith explains this in great detail in The Wealth of Nations. He argued that if individuals were allowed to seek personal gain, the effect, as though guided by an invisible hand, would be to increase the general welfare. He also advocated governments refraining from interfering in business and letting, the economy regulate itself and to protect private property. Smith was also challenging the prevailing economic doctrine of mercantilism, which at that time argued that the government should regulate trade in order to maximize their hoard of precious metals. I am not going to read this excerpt of Wealth of Nations, but we will talk about this excerpt in class. So that's a lot, right? We focus solely on Adam Smith because Adam Smith is what changes this part of the world. We'll talk about communism a little bit later. So what we're going to talk about now is the causes and effects for the cause of change, all right? So this is where we're going to talk about Karl Marx and socialism and communism. So as mercantilism and capitalism was growing in the world, the workers and the laboring classes found industrial life to be a stony desert to which they had to make habitable by their own efforts. They started creating friendly societies, which collected dues, where working class self-help groups that provided insurance against sickness, against decent allowed for decent funerals, and basically an opportunity for a social life. These were the first versions of unions. Because if a worker got sick and couldn't go to work, they often lost their jobs and couldn't pay their bills. A part of these groups, there were some, skilled artisans who had been displaced by the machines in factories. And they had actually burned mills and they took their jobs. Others were in the political arena, joining movements aimed at obtaining vote for working class men, specifically in the second half of the 19th century. These trade unions were legalized in 1824, and many joined, to achieve better wages and working conditions. The strikes that happened and the attempts of nationwide organizations made them fearful to the upper class. So this is where you start to see the rise in socialism. Socialist ideas did spread within the working class, and it challenged the assumptions of the capitalist society. So the socialism that Karl Marx had a lasting impression. Marx was German, but he grew up in England, where he actually witnessed the brutal conditions of Britain's Industrial Revolution and of Britain's capitalism. He said that industrial capitalism was an unstable system that would result in revolutionary upheaval. The revolutionary would create a classless society, ending the ancient conflict between the rich and the poor. So, to Marx, industrialization created both the social conditions against which Marx protested and the enormous wealth he felt would make socialism possible. Take a look at this, because we're going to talk about it in class. Oh, yeah. So Karl Marx went on to write the Communist Manifesto, where he laid out socialism and laid out communism. He said that masses of laborers crowded in the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates in the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class and of the bourgeoisie state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeoisie manufacturer himself. Call it throne. So, where was Marx's revolution? Eventually, the movement fizzled out altogether because many reforms were made that appeased the working class. They went on strike for better working conditions, they got better working conditions. So these improvements to the conditions during the second half of the 19th century actually helped move the working class movement elsewhere, away from full-on revolution. Marx had expected industrial capitalist societies to polarize into a wealthy class and a huge impoverished proletariat, or working class. But between these two sizable middle and lower classes, who were very happy that they were not manual laborers, shifted things a bit. Marx had not foreseen the development of this intermediary socialist or social group, so he was not expecting this middle and lower middle class to emerge. He also didn't foresee better standard of living within this capitalist framework. So wages rose under the pressure from unions, cheap imported food, improved diets, infant mortality rates dropped, shops and stores started catering towards the working class families, grew in popularity, which meant no revolution for Marx. So the reforms actually came in universal male suffrage. The vote for working class males was achieved by the second half of the 19th century in Great Britain. That's with the establishment of the House in Parliament, the lower house. You have the House of Commons, and then you have the House of Lords. House of Commons is supposed to be for the everyday working person. There was also the creation of labor unions. So the trade unions actually were legalized in 1824, and they fought for workers' rights. So wages rose because of these pressures that the unions put on the government. They also abolished child labor and actually started enforcing regulation of factory conditions. Now, as a whole, public health became a major issue during this time, so there were sanitation reforms that were put in place. They cleaned up the filth and stink of the early 19th century cities, and they created parks and open spaces so people wouldn't have to stay crammed inside their tiny tenement living conditions. So, pretty straightforward. That's how Marx lost out on this one. Okay, so what do things look like elsewhere in the world? Well, we're going to talk about the history of the HSBC in class. So this is the Bank of Shanghai. Dun, dun, dun. We'll talk about it in class. I'll see y'all later.